you might hear a lot about it, but actually the United States is not really doing anything about it. So for the Chinese, there's no cost to what they're doing. And if you look at Xi Jinping's speeches on this, yes, he says he wants to dominate this area, but he gives no specificity of what control means. He gives no timelines, no indicators of progress. He's left himself with a lot of space. So I think there might be still room to push back against China and say, we're not going anywhere. And if China really thinks they're going to come head-to-head with us over this, they might give up their view of dominance and settle for parity. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I don't see indicators actually of that they might then want to contest the second island chain, but I don't think that dominance extends to the Pacific. I think people at Indo-PACOM have some wishful thinking about Chinese intentions because they've given up on the first island chain. So I hear this a lot. It's like, oh, don't worry, China has these global ambitions, so we can hold them hostage, in Djibouti. And so if we're fighting a war with them in Taiwan, we can hold Djibouti hostage or some Pacific island, and then they'll give up Taiwan. It's like, that's not how this is going to go down. So I think a lot of planners, because the United States still has the advantage farther away from China, wants to focus on those areas because they're easy, not because China actually has any plans on being there. Is there anything we can do about it?
My next question, so yes.
Well, I spent the past 10 years trying to figure out what to do about it, so I'm a bit biased. There are a lot of really good ideas, operational concepts being floated around the Pentagon about how to think about our force posture in Asia differently. So right now, U.S. military forces are concentrated in Northeast Asia, right? Japan, South Korea. These are not the ideal places for our military forces to be for most contingencies. Most of our forces can basically be taken out in a matter of minutes by Chinese missiles. So there's a lot of discussion about how can you maintain persistent fires en masse from farther away? And this is when you think about, do we need more unmanned systems? Do we need land-based intermediate missiles? Like a lot of different types of things. Now, our biggest enemy in this is really ourselves, in that change is hard. And military bureaucracies don't like to change. So to go to a bunch of pilots who are running the Air Force and say, I can't do my plans because, when I was doing planning school, I kept on failing because I forgot about crew rest. I was like, why can't you be flying up there for 15 hours? I need you up there the whole time. It's a huge constraint to have to worry about, like, how many times people have to go to the bathroom and go to sleep, So it's like, as a planner, I want more unmanned systems, but, the pilots that run the Air Force don't want that. So I think there are still changes we can make in our force posture in terms of access countries we're operating out of and the types of systems we put there that would have a significant difference in this problem. But that requires a lot of political will and vision and guidance from those from above.
So let me get a little closer and get specific, because you did say that Xi Jinping has left himself quite a lot of room on timelines and everything else. He seems on the issue of Taiwan to actually create less and less room for himself.
Yes.
He's moved away from the idea that this is a one-country problem and allowing Taiwan to say, yeah, it's one country, it's our country, and him to say, no, it's one country, it's the PRC, one country, two systems, and now he's really starting to think about not just Taiwan being part of China's territory, but Taiwan really needs to be part of the political system, and used language about the use of force that's pretty threatening if you are in Taiwan. And the Taiwanese reaction, of course, is exactly as you would expect, to say, well, that makes it even less likely we have any cooperation here. So if you look at what's happening in Beijing and in Taipei, you're seeing a slow motion confrontation here with the United States repeatedly saying, we've war-gamed this and we're losing all of them. This doesn't sound like a place that we want to spend a lot of time if we really care about the future. How do you see the Taiwan issue? What do you think is happening with regard to Beijing? And what can we do about it, if anything?
So I am very concerned about Taiwan for the first time, actually, in probably 20 years. So there's a lot of people who focus on Taiwan, and every year they're kind of like, fear-mongering about the future conflict over Taiwan. But to date, there are many reasons to think there was nothing to worry about. One, the Chinese military, their Taiwan invasion plan was to commandeer a bunch of fishing vessels and paddle their way over, right? So for many years as a planner, you were like, got it. I know where those fishing vessels are. I take those out. Taiwan is saved. America's the hero, right? That it wasn't a problem. Also, China had this peaceful reunification policy in which they said over and over that their plan was to get closer to Taiwan, mostly economically, to convince the people of Taiwan to be a part of China. And so they also were not speaking like they wanted any trouble. And everyone said, and everyone thought, the costs of any sort of use of force against Taiwan would be so high that China wouldn't risk it. But the thing with China and with their military is that things change. And they change quickly, so you constantly have to keep your eye on this. You mentioned a few of the changes. The first is that Xi Jinping came into power, and he was no longer saying, I need to prevent independence. He was saying, I want to see progress towards reunification. That is a higher standard. Now, when he first started saying stuff like that, I dismissed it because I thought, this is just rhetoric. He's going to be leaving in 2022. No one's going to hold him accountable to his timelines of Taiwan being a part of China by 2030. Then he got rid of term limits, and so he's still going to be there. So all of a sudden, all these things he said with timelines have a new meaning, right? The credibility of his reputation is based on it. The other thing that changed it depends who you ask, as of this year, the Chinese military reorg that allows the Chinese military to conduct joint operations, which is when the different services can operate together. This is a type of operation that's necessary for an invasion of Taiwan, for example. The military is supposed to be ready to go by 2020. So most military experts like myself, we say probably 2025. When I had lunch with the Chinese defense attaché, I brought this up with him, and I said, I'm worried, you guys think you can do this. And that doesn't mean they're going to invade tomorrow, but I think just the backdrop of believing you have a military option for the first time will create a lot of problems. And I said, 2025 is going to be this tumultuous year. And he said, 2025? We're going to be able to do this next year. So then all of a sudden I get worried that you have Xi Jinping who wants to see the progress. You have a military that's providing him with the option for the first time. Then you see the re-election of Tsai Ing-wen that happened just this month in Taiwan. In China, they're starting to realize peaceful reunification is not going to happen. And so for the first time, there was a poll in the Chinese media that asked the Chinese people if they support armed reunification. 89% said yes. Now you might say, Chinese media, it's like, how trustworthy is this? When I was in Singapore with known Chinese moderates with influence in the government, these are the American handlers, speak fluent English, went to school in the United States, moderate voices. When I brought up this argument, all the Americans at the table were like, you're crazy. The Chinese were like, oh yeah, I've been pushing for armed unification this year. So I think the dynamics in China are changing in which they see it as a real option. And so even if we don't see, we call it joint island landing campaign, an amphibious assault on Taiwan tomorrow, I think the Chinese feel confident that they have those options, and so they're going to start being much more aggressive. And the Trump administration is extremely aggressive on this Taiwan issue. We're going to be constantly provoking them on it. And so I think this is going to lead to some really dangerous dynamics in the U.S.-China relationship.
One of those rough patches coming up, but our relationship will be never ever better, right?
Yeah.
No, so Taiwan is one of those issues that I think is really changing things. Hong Kong is the other one. Legislative elections coming in September. Clearly, the Chinese in Beijing miscalculated on what was happening in Hong Kong. I'm not sure they're understanding it as well as they probably should. But they can't have this going on for as long as it already has and continuing going on with, as I said, legislative elections in September, which likely will have similar results as the district elections in October, or was it November, late last year. How do you see Hong Kong playing out? What do you see happening there?
I don't really have an answer for you on Hong Kong. I'm very confused myself about what the Chinese are doing there. So the first thing is, this has gone on far longer than anyone has predicted, right? It's like 4 times longer than Tiananmen. The main assessment used to be that China would have to put a stop to this before their national day, before October 1st, right? But then that day came and went, and then now the Chinese New Year coming and going. And so I think you're right when you say the Chinese misunderstand the situation. It's similar with Taiwan in that they think the economic freedoms are the most important thing to people, and it's not really about politics. So they would say something like, Hong Kong is not about politics. If we give the younger people job prospects, cheaper housing, this will all go away. So they're focusing on trying to solve this through economic means, which I think we can see is not working. They would also say, and I don't know how to interpret this, that because they haven't rolled in with tanks, this shows the patience of Xi Jinping, right? That they are in their, kind of right to do it, they haven't done it. So instead of looking at their behavior and repression in Hong Kong and thinking, what does this say about China as a country? How dangerous are they? We should be looking at it and thinking like, oh, they're a very safe country because they haven't killed thousands of people this time, right? That's not really the American view on the Hong Kong situation. But the Chinese at least say, and it might be wishful thinking, that they think that it's dying down. Like these protests can't last forever, and that the central government's just going to outlast them. And then in the meantime, they're infiltrating the Hong Kong police forces with People's Armed Police and other sort of more high-level individuals to crack down on the repression. And over time, the Chinese are very good at repression. They're very effective at it, that they think they're going to outlast the protesters. Now, if they don't, what is their next move? That's very difficult, because it does make Xi Jinping look bad that this Hong Kong situation is coming up. So there'll be a lot of internal dynamics too that we don't even have eyes on that might influence how he reacts.
Another one of those rough patches that we're living through in the region. It's remarkable. Let me switch a little bit and talk a little bit about technology. We've been hearing so much about the advances that are happening on the technological front, that the Chinese are investing, that anybody who hasn't been there for a while comes to China and is marveling at what is happening in terms of the technological changes. How much are we seeing of that in their military capabilities? Are we seeing the Chinese using the beginnings of AI and quantum computing, and are we thinking that this is giving them the qualitative, not just the quantitative way of catching up or perhaps advancing beyond the United States, but qualitatively, are we starting to get worried that their military capability, not today, but 5 or 10 years from now, really would be in a different level than ours, or at least compete with us in a way that, frankly, no other country has ever competed with us in the past 75 years? How do you see that changing?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. There's a lot of concern about that. Just like the private sector in China, it's very bloated, right? So maybe there's a lot of waste, there's a lot of redundancy, but the government is able to direct funds, direct energy, pick certain champions to make sure they make advancements in certain areas. China can hit a moving ship at sea. The United States can't do that, right? And part of that is we never needed to, right? We don't have ships around our borders that were like, oh, we need to make sure to keep them out. But when they put their minds to wanting to do something, they tend to be able to do it. So for me, as the AI issue, I get worried that our government wants to use the tech issues and econ issues really as a protectionist measure. I'm against protectionism, so I don't want to have this viewpoint of, we have to keep certain things out or for the sake of, promoting certain industries. But there are some areas that are dual use, and in my view, U.S. companies should not be contributing to the lethality of the Chinese military. So the first thing we do have to do, part of their innovation, and Xi Jinping says it very bluntly, is stealing foreign technology. Right? That is part of the backbone of what they do, because they have areas that they're not as good in. And so what they do is they steal the technology from their country. So we have to be able to protect our technologies in those areas. For AI, it's very interesting. In the US military, we feel more comfortable with a person in the loop. Right? If you remember the debates about unmanned systems and stuff, the idea that there's, and in the Air Force, we don't call them drones. We're they're not drones, they have a pilot, but there's a person there. For the Chinese, because their people are not well trained and they're not well educated, getting the people out of the loop actually makes them think they're going to have a more effective force. So they think about AI as a force multiplier in a different way kind of than we do. AI as the decision maker, and being able to run algorithms for them and decide, what do I fire on first, second, and third? In the United States, we think our military strength comes from things that mission command, in which you get central objectives, but then the lower levels get to decide how to do things. We have just a very different way of thinking about military power. It's hard for me to say when push comes to shove which one's better. I'm very biased because I've been raised in this military culture to think that it's our agility and flexibility during times of war that make us more successful. China has a view of war that they can predict every possible thing that happens. It's called war control, right? So in America, we think they're crazy. The second, they have any sort of conflict, their whole plans are going to fall apart, and then they're going to be in a complete state of panic. But this has worked for them in the past, 3 wars that they've fought. So it's hard to say what is going to get you farther. Is it the agility and flexibility of the U.S. military to adapt to changing realities on the ground, or is it systems that are in place that can analyze huge amounts of data and spit out what the right decision is in real time? So I'm not sure which one it is yet.
Well, I think nobody really knows, which is part of the problem that we're facing. But they're investing in great levels, and the question of whether we can actually, through active measures, prevent them from advancing as fast as we want them to is, I think, one of the core issues we're facing in our country. We're trying to, it seems to me, on the political side, on both sides of the aisle, the answer is becoming increasingly, why don't we cut ourselves off? Why don't we find a way to do less with them? Why don't we, the terminology of decoupling technologically, or as Hank Paulson said, the iron curtain that is descending, the technological iron curtain that is descending between our countries technologically and economically. Is that a viable strategy?
No. And the biggest issue is, it's not just the U.S. and China in this world.
Right.
Right? There are a lot of other countries. And so far, the United States has not been convincing in telling other countries they shouldn't adopt, for example, Huawei for 5G networks, for a lot of countries. The reason we're not convincing, I think, is twofold. Of course, some countries understand it's a security risk. But just like on my phone, I have that Face ID, and then all my passwords are on my phone, so I don't have to log in to all my bank accounts separately. My husband is he's 14 years defense, so he's this is a nightmare. I'm well, I don't want to remember all my passwords. Convenience often trumps security risk. And so for the majority of countries, these dual-use technologies, they're it helps our economy, it's convenient for us, I don't care about the security risk. Or they think that they can handle the security risk, they can mitigate it in some ways. The third category of countries, are ones in which the United States, we come in and we say, you don't want to deal with Huawei, with these companies, because they're connected to the state. It's a very American view to trust companies more than governments, right? I would rather Facebook have all my data than the US government have all my data. In the majority of the world, it's the opposite. So they say, yes, Huawei's connected to the Chinese government. So if Huawei does something bad, I go complain to China. Multinational corporations come in here and do all sorts of bad things. I complain to the US government, and the US says, well, that's not us. Right? So so I think they also think about that differently. And for most countries, they're going to be reliant on somebody. In the United States, we think so much about our sovereignty. We have the power to make sure other countries don't influence our decisions and our policies. So we, go to the Uruguays of the world, and we're forget about the economic benefits and the convenience and all this other stuff. You'll have to care about what China thinks about Hong Kong. And they're I'll say whatever China wants me to say about Hong Kong. I don't care, right? So it's a very difficult situation to be in on the U.S. side. We're not being very persuasive to get other countries around the world to get on the same page with us about the technological challenge that China poses.
I'm going to open it up next, but one final question, which gets to the really big issue. You talked about China wanting to have the same outcome. They want to be where the United States is. The United States is a global power. It's present everywhere, at every moment. It has interests that are truly global, although we're having a small debate here in the United States, the degree to which that is the right way to think about it. But that's how we've traditionally thought about it. When Xi Jinping wakes up in the morning and looks at where China is 10, 15, 20 years from now, does he see a China that has global power, has global influence? Or does he see a country that is still a regional player and perhaps a dominant regional player in East Asia, but a regional player? How should we look at China as, in terms of their ambitions, without casting stones either way? How do you think we should look at it?
I think Xi Jinping, I think they want to be a global power, but that means something very different to China than it means to the United States. So when the United States, after World War II, decided it wanted to be a global power, it didn't build a colonial empire because Great Britain had one before it. So in that mindset, China does not look at how the United States exercises global power, which is mainly the backbone is global military power projection capabilities. Foreign military intervention is a key tool of our foreign policy, and the international institution framework that we've set up and free trade on that international scale. They look at that and they don't want to replicate that. They don't want to replace the United States. They want to displace us. And specifically, the way they think about power is that, first of all, in the majority of the world, they can accomplish the same goals more efficiently with economic power. They want to have a veto in the Middle East. They want to have a veto in Europe. They don't need to have boots on the ground there, and they don't want to have boots on the ground there. In Asia, I think militarily they want to dominate that region. But outside of Asia, I think it's mainly political and economic. That is really where their focus lies. And so a lot of times we always think, like with Belt and Road, people used to say, oh, if I see bases along Belt and Road, I'll know it's a real challenge. The challenge is already there, right? And it's very difficult because the United States, we're trying to do more of the same stuff we do. In Southeast Asia, we're like, we'll just sell them more military equipment and do more military exercises. If we're the security partner of choice, we'll win that competition. But being the security partner of choice is no longer enough. So I think, China's vision is global, but also what regions are important. In the Cold War, you didn't have to dominate every part of the world to be a superpower. You have to dominate the most important ones. And we had decided, that Europe was one of the most important ones. That region is now Asia. So even when I say they only want to dominate Asia, that's because whoever is a dominant power in Asia is the superpower of the world. And so we also have to get our mind around the fact that the areas of wealth, prosperity, growth, those have changed in the past 70 years. And so our priorities, I think, should lie in Asia because of that.
You're saying that to a NATO ambassador. That's though. I interestingly enough, so NATO had its first leader summit level discussion on China in London, and apparently it was a very interesting and focused discussion. But it was all about China in East Asia. There was no discussion about China in Europe. So China now has formal economic relationships as through the Belt and Road with 17 European countries. It owns the major ports in Greece. Italy has signed a memorandum of understanding to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Portugal, a good part of its economy is completely integrated with China. So China's already in Europe. The idea that NATO should have a strategy about something that's happening in Asia, but ignore the political and economic engagement in China is just to reinforce this idea that presence is military, not economic, and certainly not political, is very much part of this new world that we all have to adjust to.
And our alliances also have to evolve, right? Our alliances are basically military defense pacts, but we aren't well coordinated on economic issues, right? And this happens all the time. If China uses economic coercion against one of our allies and partners, they don't do anything. Imagine a world in which China threatened Australia. They were mad at Australia, and they said, we're pulling all of our students out of Australia. And the Australian education system is very reliant on Chinese students. Imagine a world in which China threatened that. The U.S. response was, then we're not going to let Chinese students in the United States. They would stop with that nonsense. But the problem is with the economic coercion, it's like every country for themselves. If the Norwegians are suffering because the Chinese won't buy salmon, the rest of Europe is like, I'm going to pretend I don't know what's going on so the Chinese don't come for me next. So I think there needs to be a renewal of how we think about our alliances and partnerships to create resiliency and protection against more than just military invasion, but other types of policies that can be harmful to our countries.
Makes a lot of sense. Let me open it up. We'll start all the way in the back, and wait till you get a microphone.
Thank you. First of all,
And please do ask a question.
oh, I'm not shy. 8 rows back, the power projection of Evo's socks is overwhelming. So thank you for the socks. But more importantly, in some ways, when I hear you speak, Professor, I have this really chilling reaction. I can almost see a vision of Wake Island, 1940, 1941, and what's our fallback position? And maybe it's not a fallback position, but how would you engineer a coalition with China? So rather than being an adversary, it's cooperation. As it's cooperation against Russia and North Korea, and is that possible?
I think that's what we were doing for the majority of U.S.-China relations. It was possible. Right? When I first started studying China, it was like the heyday of U.S.-China relations. China was trying to reassure smaller countries, have positive relations with great powers. There was a lot of hope that this was definitely a future in which both of our countries could coexist, work together to maintain the peace and order of the world. When Xi Jinping came into power, he had a different vision for China. And that vision was one that excluded a U.S. role in Asia. And it directly conflicts with U.S. interests. And so the problem is now that until we can convince the Chinese that there's room enough for both of us in Asia, I don't see a lot of room for the type of vision that you're laying out. So I'm still hopeful, because I think Chinese strategy and interest, I don't think stem from the nature of their political system. So if I can make a broad generalization between like liberals and conservatives in DC, one of the main differences, while we're both want to compete with China, is a lot of conservatives think that there's an inherent evil to the Communist Party and that they are a threat to the United States no matter what they do. My view is that they are threatening to the United States because of certain policies they've chosen to adopt. And so if Xi Jinping tomorrow said that he's going to change his position on the United States military being allowed within the first island chain, and that we can both be there, and that the United States is a force of stability instead of what they write about in their military doctrine, the underlying force of instability in the region, then I think we have a lot to work with. But right now, the U.S. position is we're willing to both be there. We're not trying to kick the Chinese out, but the Chinese are not willing. So it makes it very difficult for us to reach those types of agreements that you allude to.
So for those who are joining us online, and I encourage you to continue to submit your questions online, ccga.live. Here's a question just as a follow-up on that, because that describes a pretty zero-sum view. Mm-hmm. How do you de-escalate that situation? Because how do you find a way, even in that zero-sum confrontation, and just focus on Asia for a minute, because that's what you were focusing on. How do you de-escalate that?
So I think there's two things. The first one is to have a different approach to getting to a better place. So I think our standard strategy has been try to look for some low-hanging fruit. Maybe if we cooperate with China on, transnational diseases and certain areas.
Sounds like a good idea, right?
Yeah, it's like, then we'll build goodwill, and then we can translate that goodwill into dealing with some of the tough issues we've talked about today. That's not how China thinks about things and how things work. So I think the first thing is we have to start with the toughest issues. Right? When we normalize relations with China, the number one thing we dealt with is what are our positions on Taiwan. Right? The rest of it is kind of like we'll follow. So we have to think about what are the most important things to the United States, the toughest things, the things that are causing the most tension in the relationship, which we've covered some of them today. And then we have to realize that we're not going to get to an agreement on any of these issues. So I was at a conference recently, and the Washington Post covered it as like a clashing of younger generation, older generation China experts. But it was kind of frustrating. The older generation was like, well, we just used diplomacy and everything worked. And I was like, that was like the 1970s in which China had no power, no choice. Like, of course it worked. We're dealing with a different type of country. They have so many options now. So I think this idea that we can persuade them that they're better off with us in charge and that they don't understand their own interests, we need to tell them what their interests are, doesn't work. So we need to come to mutual understandings, not agreements, right? Of things like, China, we understand, like with Taiwan. We recognize that you think Taiwan is a part of China. We need to have those same understandings. China, we recognize that you think all these islands in the South China Sea are yours. China, you recognize that it's core to U.S. national security for us to be able to be present in the South China Sea. And so I think that's the starting point, is just to get on the same page about what is important to us and why it's important to us, and have the most difficult conversations first, and then see if we can put all that stuff aside, kind of freeze it like we did with the Taiwan situation, and figure out ways to move forward.
Makes a lot of sense. Let's go back and open up the floor. We'll go right here in the third row.
Thank you. Hi there.
Hi, Edwin.
Let's talk about difficult conversations, and pardon me, I have a cold. What's the role of values in this conversation? The most difficult issue I see, whether it's in Asia or around the world in the use of technology.
Put the microphone a little closer.
I'm sorry. Is we value individuals and individual freedom. China doesn't. have a different view about that. That's why they're so good at repression. Is there a room for a values discussion, whether it's over the future of Taiwan or any place else in this, and how can we use that in our foreign policy?
So, you know, the national security strategy had the word values in it 33 times. The Trump administration is very focused on this values, using values as an advantage in the competition with the United States, with China. But I think they're going about it the wrong way for a few reasons. The first is, I think people can smell a hypocrite, kind of, and I won't name names, but I was briefing one of our ambassadors before they went over who was in charge of some human rights issues. And he was like, I'm gonna, just shame China and poke them in the eye about human rights, make them look bad. And I was like, okay, but do you have any ideas about how to improve human rights in China? And he was like, well, no, I didn't really think about that. And I was like, don't you think everyone's gonna know that you actually don't care about human rights, right? That you're actually just trying to make China look bad, which is sort of one thing. So the first thing is, do we actually live up to those values? And a lot of times, people don't think so, whether it's on human rights or even freedom of navigation, which we seem to have a pretty consistent policy on, but our policy is that we have the freedom to navigate. No one doubts that. Our Navy sails around, China doesn't mess with us, and we're like, we're protecting freedom of navigation, but everyone else is sailing around, China's harassing them, we don't do anything about it. So we're actually not protecting freedom of navigation. So the first thing is to think about those values and actually be adhering to them. And the second thing, and it pains me to say this, but for a long time I used to give this talk and I would say, the United States has a vision of the world that's beneficial for more than just the United States. Everyone agrees it's better to be a partner of the United States than it is to be a partner of China. But then I spent some time talking to people in governments outside of my area of expertise, people in the developing world, in the Middle East, in the Maghreb, in Latin America. And their experiences with the United States hasn't always been, I'm really worried about China, taking advantage of me and not respecting my sovereignty, but the United States has always been this stellar partner. So in government, everyone says we have a messaging problem, right? That we do everything right. Why aren't we're just bad at communicating it to the rest of the world? I think we have a policy problem in that a lot of the world, for many countries, and of course the Australias, Japans, Western Europes of the world are not a part of this. They obviously would prefer for the United States to make the rules, but for a lot of other countries, to be close to China, they've got to have some position on Taiwan. Domestically, nobody cares. To be close to the United States, we have all these demands that might threaten their power, threaten the things that they hold dear. So I think there has to be a more comprehensive understanding of what the rest of the world needs and wants than what we currently have. Because at least in my experience, the view is, any wargaming I do, any of this type of stuff, it's like something happens and everyone agrees the United States is right, and everyone thinks China's in the wrong. I'm like, I don't think that's the way it's going to go. So I think values are important, and it gets frustrating with the economic, espionage, tech threat. You think, well, why don't we just do what the Chinese do? They go into countries, they have no labor laws, no environmental standards. I think quality matters, I think values matter. But we gotta do it right. And unfortunately, I think in a lot of cases we haven't. And that's why the message is not being so embraced by most of the world.
So another question relevant here online that follows up on that and actually relates to another trip that we took in the council to Ethiopia and Rwanda in October. And there was this, for the travelers, this question about why do we see so much Chinese building and influence, and every village you went through had a sign, satellite TV brought to you by China Aid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when you asked, so why do you do this with the Chinese? Their answer was very simple.
Yeah.
They're here with money and you're not. So it wasn't just a value issue, it was even a money issue. It's just showing up to be part of that. So question, China and Africa. What are the Chinese trying to do in Africa? Are they trying to make Africa a bigger, more, are they trying to help economic development in Africa? Are they trying to get as many resources out of it as they can for themselves? Are they trying to displace other powers and playing a power game? Are they doing it all three? How do you look at the China in Africa movement that's really been going on now for about 20 years.
I think there's different aspects of the Chinese bureaucracy that have different interests in Africa. I think one is obviously control of certain natural resources that will fuel the domestic growth of China, and also diversity of those resources, because they are also students of history, and so they know that if anything bad happens, the first thing the United States is going to want to try to do is cut them off from certain resources that they need. That's, in their view, where Japan went wrong, and so they don't want to have the same types of
Japan
problems.
went wrong in 1941.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
okay.
right, because they were so reliant on like maritime trade and oil. So they do want to have the resources and the diversity of resources. They do, depending on who you ask, it is also about economic development. And that's what the Belt and Road ostensibly is about. It's about creating markets outside of China for Chinese goods. And that is how they'll overcome some of like the middle income traps, some of the things that economists who know much more about this issue than I do talk about. These are countries that, that don't have huge consumer bases, and so China's trying to help with the consumer base. And in the Chinese experience, the reason why China was such an economic miracle was infrastructure, right? China can get a good that is produced in one of their countrysides or villages. This was from the beginning of the Chinese Reform era, where all the manufacturing was happening, to a port more quickly than anyone, right? It's quicker to get something from the middle of China to their port than it is to get something from Vietnam to a port. And Vietnam, as we know, it's like so close to water. Why does it take them so long, right? So the Chinese realize that that's their advantage, and so they want to bring that to the rest of the world to help the interconnectivity, to help their markets. But the third thing is also political. We live in a world of international institutions, which countries have a say of what is legitimate, what's not legitimate, what norms of behavior are appropriate or not. And so when we come to China and we have a letter and we say, we have these 20 nations, I think it was 23, sign this letter saying that your internment of the Uyghurs is bad, China was like, oh, interesting. And we have a letter signed by 35 countries, mostly Muslim nations, saying we're doing a really good job about how we treat the Uyghurs, right? So a lot of it is also political. They get the support and the votes in these international organizations. And what you brought up about the United States not being there, China's not out-competing us, we're not competing. When's the last time the president had like a state dinner for the president of Ethiopia? Right, but China also rolls out the red carpet for them besides the economic investment. And so I do think, we have to make a decision. Do we want to compete for influence in these parts of the world? And if so, showing up is half the battle.
As Woody Allen once said. Terry Diamond, right up front here.
How would you evaluate China's cybersecurity capability, and correspondingly, how would you evaluate, and this is broader than China, our defensive cyber capabilities at the Defense Department, the security departments, and intelligence agencies?
So cyber is like one of these like spooky areas, right? In which like the majority of things you can say about cyber are extremely general and not useful. So I'll try to put it in a certain way. So I'm less worried about Chinese cyber than I am about Russian cyber. Not so much because of capabilities, but because of how the Chinese think about the role of cyber in warfare. So I am not concerned that like they're going to be attacking civilian infrastructure in a wartime environment. I think the Chinese understand how escalatory that is. I think they don't really need to go there. So the main concerns right now from a cyber perspective that I have is about rendering a lot of military systems inefficient so that we can't deploy forces, can't mobilize, right? So, Transcom, which is our functional command that deals with, getting assets into place, most of their networks are on unclassified networks. If China was able to shut those down, then we can't start flowing forces. They take Taiwan in a number of days, the war's over, right? So there are cyber threats to the defense infrastructure. I'm not a tech expert, but what I'm told is, in a lot of cases, defense is very difficult, offense is easier. So what we're trying to do is establish a deterrent relationship, kind of like what we have in the nuclear realm. The problem with that, I've been a part of so many of these discussions about what we call cross-domain deterrence, of like trying to think like, can we threaten China with an attack in another realm than cyber to keep them from using cyber? Deterrence is so hard with cyber because nobody dies. So we have to be able to threaten very high costs to keep China from using cyber because it's so effective, right? If they can win the whole war by just taking out Transcom, it's really hard to convince them not to do that. So we have to threaten immense costs against them to deter them. But that becomes very incredible because no one has died, right? So if we say something, and this is just an example, so nobody panic, but if we said something like, we will use nuclear weapons against you if you use cyber, like, yes, that is a high enough cost that China wouldn't use cyber, but also it is not credible that the United States is going to nuke China after no one has died and Transcom just couldn't get online for a couple of days. So at least in all the situations I've been a part of, I haven't been able to think of good policies and scenarios in which we're able to establish enough of a deterrent to convince China not to use these extremely effective tools. So right now, I think the main focus is on building redundancy versus resiliency. If you can't protect everything, maybe you try to have a lot more stuff, whether it's cyberspace, what have you, so that China feels like it's a less effective way of dealing with the U.S. military.
So one of the secrets is that our nuclear systems are still, in many ways, run with 5 1/4 and 8.5 inch floppy disks. They never, they went beyond that, so they never did any of that. That's our cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Some of it is so old they don't know how to deal with it. Kay Torsion. Wait for a microphone. Otherwise, you won't be part of the live stream.
Oh, that would be terrible.
Exactly.
I'm watching Hong Kong, and I've done business in Hong Kong and also in Singapore. And we look at Hong Kong as a gateway to China without all the financial risks, that you can control them better. So people have confidence if they deal with the Chinese in Hong Kong, it's not like dealing on the mainland. That may not be true, but that's the perception. Now, with the Hong Kong situation, and also with what's going on in Taiwan, and with the change of increasing use of AI and the attitude toward individuals who are successful, where some of them just disappear, investors may feel less comfortable investing there, and I believe that foreign investment is very important to China. How are they going to deal with this situation?
So I think there's two aspects to your question. The first is just to highlight, I just want to reiterate what you said, which was absolutely correct, is, Xi Jinping has really upped the repression game. Within China, the mainland, also Hong Kong, my first book, I did archival work in China. Xi Jinping came to power. He shut down all the archives. They have requirements of only using Chinese books in schools and no Western texts. The level of control has definitely increased. And you talk about investors. I mean, I travel to China all the time, and I canceled a trip last year at the recommendation of some people in government because they're just randomly arresting people. I have a colleague, Michael Kovrig, who's been sitting in a Chinese prison for no reason because, well, we know the reason. It's because the Canadians, arrested a Huawei executive for corruption, right? So everyone's really nervous about, and recently a Japanese scholar was just invited by a Chinese institution and then arrested, right? So I think everyone is a little bit like, what is going on, right? And I only half joke, being in the military, the Chinese would be really stupid to arrest me for no reason because the U.S. government can't leave me there. I know too much, right? Someone's gonna have to come and get me. So I'm safer, so I travel back and forth. But I think you're right. I mean, I think Xi Jinping has made the calculation that, because they're also talking about decoupling and stuff. They're getting very confident about their economic model as well, that it's worth it to them to protect their party and the stability. If it risks some foreign investment, those foreigners can go somewhere else. Like that's what usually I go to China during times of tension, and it's always like, let's cooperate, let's mend the relationship, let's move forward. And when I was there in October at a track 1.5, they were like, fine, decouple, we don't care, go somewhere else. And that's the first I'd ever kind of seen that kind of attitude. So I think they probably realize the risks, but given the importance of Hong Kong and other things to them, they're like, they think that they're doing us a favor by letting us invest there. That's kind of the attitude right now.
Andy Zamanides.
You know, on the one hand, we hear about the urgency. China's in the national security strategy. You talk about the military threat to AI on trade. But then you pointed out there are certain places where we just don't show up. Ivo pointed out the investments in Europe. And in at least two of those examples, the European countries told the U.S., we want an American buyer, and we just did not come. Who's not getting it? Where's the gap? Because even, for example, Belt and Road, we passed the Build Act, and then we said it doesn't apply anywhere in Europe.
Yeah. Yeah, so I would say, we've decided to compete, but we haven't decided how to compete yet. We're actually doing nothing new when it comes to like what we're doing in Asia, for example. A lot of people are like thinking about, even the Build Act wasn't, you think of how much money China is putting into this. And my view is like, we're trying to compete with China by doing exactly what they do. Imagine running a company and doing that. You start a new company and you're like, I'm inferior at building this product, but I'm gonna try to compete with the top person by building this product. Like, that's not our area of strength. And so, and then in the military, I could go on about how problematic our military forces are. Since I was just recently promoted, I'm in the middle of a military course that I spend all my time online thinking about like practicing how to engage with tribal leaders and planning contingencies in Somalia and Afghanistan. There is a section on every region of the world in the course that I'm doing except East Asia. And so we have a whole military force that has no conception of what a conflict in Asia would look like. We live in a world in Afghanistan that you get injured, you could be at a top-tier hospital in a matter of hours. In a conflict in Asia, we don't even go get you, right? So it's like, when you ask, like, why is this the case? Besides me ranting about it a lot, because I find it very frustrating that I'm trying to move the needle a little bit, I think a lot of it has to do with sort of the function, two things. The first is I feel like our senior leaders are so fearful of failure that they will not try anything new. Like, I have had these conversations in which I'm not even suggesting crazy things. Like I suggested recently, taking more diplomatic initiatives on the South China Sea, holding a summit with other claimants to talk about which features have maritime rights and which don't. And the response I got back was, too risky. If Southeast Asian countries don't like it, we'll look bad, we're not gonna do it. Or I'm like, well, why don't we improve our relationship with Vietnam by doing A, B, and C? They'll probably say, no, we're not gonna do it. So it's like the fear of failure and of trying new things, this lack of sort of entrepreneurial spirit or the hunger of like, this is really a serious issue. And we have to be able to try things and maybe they don't work out and then we change policies. There's no appetite for this at the highest levels of government, in my experience, and obviously it's easier for me to say this because I'm at the lower end of the totem pole, so I'm not responsible for anything, I just advise, but if anything goes wrong, it's not on my shoulders. But we do have to think more innovatively, and I often say to leaders, kind of, provocative way, like, if your life depended on this, you're telling me you couldn't convince the Philippines to give you access to that base. There's nothing you could do? Nothing you could do to get Vietnam on your side? What if we agreed with them on all their territorial disputes? They wouldn't support us? And it's like, well, then maybe they would, but I don't know if that's a good policy. Maybe it's a horrible policy, but I think we should brainstorm new ideas, go through them before we throw them out. But right now it's like, well, I want to compete. I've got a guy who's been doing these foreign military sales for 30 years. Let's just like ask him to do more of that. And there's just no appetite to doing anything new or different. And so I always say, like, I'm on board with Trump and competing with China, but he's also doing everything possible to ensure we lose that competition, right? He's pissing off all of our allies and partners. He's, economics is the basis of power. He's, so protectionist against free trade. It's so problematic. The Chinese love President Trump. They had all these timelines that they've now hastened. They're like, okay, we'll be number one by 2030, and now they're like 2025, right? So it's very problematic.
We're going around the world telling people not to buy a Huawei, and they say, good, we'll buy the American system, turns out.
I don't have one.
Not a lot of American systems in there.
Yeah.
Oriana, thank you so much for enlightening us on what's happening in China. More importantly, for providing a fresh, new perspective. Questioning your elders and leaders is a good idea. Continue doing it in university, in the Air Force, in the U.S. military, and come back to Chicago often to talk about these issues. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.